I am your host, Jenny Walk. I am delighted. This is the third in the series that we've done. And before we commence, I would just like to acknowledge that these webinars are brought to us on behalf of Queensland Government, Department of Employment, Small Business and Training. We're very excited. We've had lots of questions and engagement on the workshops, on these webinars over the last few weeks. And we do encourage you to continue to ask your questions and post questions during the webinar. You'll have access to the Q&A, which I'll show you in a moment. Please note your comments won't be seen, as our moderator will be moderating the questions to make sure that we have time to address them as we go through. So let's get started. So before we started, I'm a proud Bundjalung woman. I live on Turrbal Yagara country in southeast Queensland. I'm currently at Cherbourg on Waka Waka country, so I want to pay my respects to the elders of this land and the opportunity to be able to present from Cherbourg today. I'd like to warmly pay my respects to all traditional custodians and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us on these calls today, and pay my respects to your ancestors, your elders, past and present, and all those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are wanting here at the moment to make a change and to make a difference in their lives. I would like to also encourage you to reflect on the traditional owners and the country that you're joining us on today across Queensland. A bit of housekeeping to start. As I mentioned, these sessions will be being recorded, and we're encouraging you to post questions throughout the session. All the questions will be answered in our Q&A, which is at the end of the session. The session today will run for around 45 minutes, after which we'll have the 10 to 15 minutes of questions. And if you are not familiar with Teams, you'll see at the very top of your screen the option to ask Q&A. Click on that link and you'll be able to post your questions in there. As I mentioned before, your questions won't be seen until the moderator posts the questions at the end of the session. So the Cultural Capability Toolkit was developed in 2022 in conjunction with DESBT, and it's designed to be a resource and guide for small to medium enterprises to help them build their cultural awareness, cultural understanding, and provide a resource to build their understanding of engaging with First Nations people, and particularly establishing cultural safe workplaces for all your employees. The objective, which is the toolkit, which is available online, has 4 key objectives. The first objective is to provide an opportunity and resource to enhance your cultural understanding. And this is about helping businesses and employees understand the unique perspectives, customs and protocols of First Nations peoples. Secondly, it's about developing inclusive workplaces. So the toolkit provides resources that help equip organisations with the knowledge to create culturally safe environments where First Nations employees feel respected and valued. It's a toolkit that provides guidance for effective engagement for small businesses, providing actionable steps to engage respectfully and meaningfully with First Nations employees, communities, and including strategies for recruitment and retention, which is what we're talking about today. Finally, the aim of the toolkit is to really drive positive outcomes in the community and encourage organisations to integrate cultural diversity into their business practices, ultimately leading to improved innovation, satisfaction, and overall business success. The toolkit is a practical resource aimed at increasing cultural capability while ensuring your business meets the social responsibilities that it as a business in this current environment, and contribute to the empowerment of First Nations people through inclusion, respect, and long-term engagement. Now, over the last couple of weeks, we've had a lot of questions around recruitment, selection, onboarding, and engagement of First Nations staff. So today, I'm very excited that we're going to be hopefully addressing many of those questions in our session today, which is around valuing cultural diversity and effective recruitment of First Nations staff or employees. In today's webinar, we're looking at 4 key areas, and the 4 key takeaways you'll get is around discovering the benefits of cultural diversity, and we're reaffirming some of the conversation that we've had over the last couple of weeks. And this is around diverse perspectives that drive innovation and business success. We're going to look at effective recruitment strategies and at retention strategies that explore best practices for attracting and hiring First Nations talent, and importantly, onboarding and engagement of that talent to understand how you can create an environment and an onboarding process that creates a supportive place for them to work. Finally, it's about becoming an employer of choice. We recognize that creating a workplace that is culturally diverse and culturally safe will improve your business outcomes long term. So we want to help you understand how to position your business as a preferred place for First Nations employees to work. And of course, all the tips and ideas we're getting today come from our Cultural Capability Toolkit. And towards the end of the webinar, we'll provide you a link where you can access the information for the webinar and continue your learning in your office. So let's get started. So to start, we want to talk about the importance of creating culturally inclusive recruitment. Now here, culturally inclusive recruitment isn't just about filling quotas. It's actually about attracting a broader talent pool and ensuring your workforce reflects the diversity in Australia. First Nations employees, we know, bring you unique perspectives that can drive innovation and help your businesses navigate new opportunities. Additionally, fostering strong relationships with First Nations employees and their communities through inclusive hiring practices can also strengthen your brand and contribute to reconciliation efforts. For businesses, inclusive recruitment demonstrates also social responsibility, showing that your organisation values diversity and is committed to equity within your workplace. Key to building culturally inclusive recruitment is looking at how your organisation is currently faring on a culturally diverse space. So one of the options that we reflect in the Cultural Capability Toolkit online that we have on the call out button here is around conducting a cultural diversity audit of your recruitment channels and to assess whether they're actually attracting First Nations people. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. Ensuring that your job advertisements are culturally inclusive and are actually the language is encouraging diverse people to apply for your role, and in particular First Nations applicants, is a great way to start to build a culturally inclusive recruitment policy. But sometimes you need a little bit more than just a simple policy. So one of the key ways that we see organisations having success is developing a diversity, equity and inclusion team or working group. Now, whether you're a very large organisation or only a small organisation of 4 or 5 people, you can actually start a D&I group or working group within your team. And it's one of the most effective ways to ensure that your organisation is prepared to create an inclusive environment. The role of a DEI team is to develop and review the policies, to have a look at the business and how it's operating, to ensure that you are fostering a culturally safe workplace. And it's not just for First Nations employees. A DEI team actually reflect on the overall culture of the organisation to ensure that everybody is showing up in a safe way and that they're able to share a little bit about their history and bring that to work. And it does certainly foster inclusivity. The group should also focus on ensuring that the workplace is free of discrimination and open to diverse cultural practices. So this may be a review of cultural policies, which is something that we discussed in the previous webinar, which we encourage you to go back and look at if you haven't seen, or to dive into the Cultural Capability Toolkit to see how you might review your policies as well. It's important to ensure that your D&I team has diverse representation, including any First Nations employees that you have, to ensure that their voices are heard from different backgrounds. Now, this may mean if you don't have a diverse environment, you might reach out to other organisations or even DESBIT or the Cultural Capability Toolkit to see how you can actually find supporting resources to help you ensure that your DEI reflection is looking at those diverse perspectives, and you can invite people outside the organisation to come and join your team. The team also plays a key role in monitoring progress, and we talked about progress and KPIs in our last webinar. Setting clear inclusivity goals and holding the organisation accountable is critical for creating and maintaining a culturally inclusive workplace. Through this team also, you can look at your learning strategies and whether you're facilitating cultural awareness for cultural learning training, making sure your policies include cultural practices like cultural leave, and importantly, start looking at driving recruitment strategies that attract and retain your First Nations employees. So to start building your own D&I, identify members or staff members across your organisation who are interested in looking at building the diversity across your organisation and deep diving into cultural safety. Now, these don't have to be traditionally HR roles. There might be people from your project teams. There might be some people from your frontline and indeed people from your executive. So bringing a diverse group of people within the organisation to tackle D&I is a great way to start looking at cultural diversity. I talked about recruitment strategies. So once you identify what you need and what you're missing in your organisation, we want to start looking at how we can develop recruitment strategies for First Nations talent. And there are lots of different ways that we can do this. A simple way for a small organisation is to actually partner with First Nations organisations and recruitment organisations that can help you find and identify suitable First Nations employees that fit the roles that you're looking for in your organisation to match the skills and the needs of not only now, but what your organisation might need in the future. These organisations can really help you reach out to find the right candidates and ensure that the recruitment processes are aligned to the cultural needs of First Nations peoples. So, for example, you may consider posting your jobs on Indigenous job boards or connecting with local First Nations networks to broaden your talent pool. And there are many opportunities, particularly in Southeast Queensland and across Queensland generally, that Desbert is providing to actually connect you with First Nations recruitment agencies that can help you find that talent and help you to understand how to position it from job advertisements. Another key point when looking at your job description and your job adverts is to ensure that they're culturally sensitive. It's important not to include technical jargon if it's not relevant to the role, and make sure that you're using language that is inclusive and not unintentionally exclusionary for some applicants. Being clear about your commitment to diversity and inclusion and considering offering traineeships or internships specifically for First Nation candidates is another way that you can look at building your talent pool. So you may be looking at long-term planning, not just short-term roles at frontline employees, looking at creating pathways for First Nations people across your organisation, whether it be in traineeships or internships, or perhaps graduate programs for those coming out of university. It's important, though, that your First Nations so that your recruitment practices are really welcoming. So ensuring that your recruitment is culturally sensitive will ensure that you build trust and encourages more First Nations applicants to apply. And we mentioned early on about becoming an employer of choice. Creating culturally diverse and culturally inclusive recruitment practices is the best way to start that process for your organisation. One way to drive that is actually to create a formal First Nations recruitment and engagement strategy. Developing its own recruitment and engagement strategy for First Nations people is a way that you can actually focus your effort and ensure that the goals that you're trying to achieve are aligned with your business outcomes. It's really important that any strategy that you develop is aligned with your broader cultural values and inclusive hiring goals. And it starts with actively promoting job opportunities, as I've mentioned, through networks and organisations, but additionally ensuring that your onboarding process includes cultural awareness training so that new hires feel welcomed into a workplace. And we're going to talk a little bit about specifically around onboarding processes in a moment. Another way when you're looking at developing a recruitment and engagement strategy is to consider how people want to be treated during that recruitment process and what are the best ways from a cultural sensitive way to actually engage and attract people to your organisation. So offering mentorship and leadership programs as part of your broader strategy. So we're not just looking at each piece in isolation. It's not just about recruitment or onboarding or selection. It's about the whole piece and the employee life cycle. So a dedicated First Nations recruitment and engagement strategy invites your organisations to start considering the whole process and the life cycle of your employees from the time they're attracted to your organisation to the time that they're outboarded when they're actually moving on to their next career. So let's talk at the start of that process. How do we attract First Nations peoples into your workplace? And this is important, particularly for small to medium enterprises. It's important to position yourself as that employer of choice. So creating a workplace that is culturally safe and supportive and inclusive is not just about putting out a good job ad, it's about creating that culture in the workplace. So what is your organization's commitment to diversity? What does that look like for someone who's looking at your organization externally? When I see a job ad from your organization, does it invite me and make me believe that your organization is open to diverse policies and practices? Do I believe that it's a culturally safe environment? And as we spoke in the webinar one, creating that culturally safe environment is critical before we start even engaging a recruitment or attraction process. Understanding how your organization is viewing in the lens in which it sees cultural diversity is really key to creating your baseline policies. Flexible and supportive workplace policies such as cultural leave or cultural practices, as we mentioned last time, accommodating family and community responsibilities and ensuring respect for cultural practices are key to these strategies and attracting First Nations employees. And in fact, creating culture diverse practices in your policies is actually key to creating diversity across your organization, not just with First Nations people. These policies do make your workplace more attractive to everybody who are looking, particularly those who are looking for environments where they will feel actively supported and respected throughout their employment with you. Building strong community relations is another great way to actually attract First Nations employees as well. Actively engaging First Nations communities and community groups, supporting First Nations-led initiatives, and demonstrating your long-term commitment to inclusion is another way that you can position yourself as an employer of choice. By becoming visible and respected in the community in which you work, you make your organisation a natural choice for First Nations talent within that community. So one way to start this process in understanding if your organisation is an employer of choice, assess your current workplace policies to ensure that they are culturally inclusive and communicate these benefits clearly in your job advertisements. You may also want to go one step further in communicating this through your website and social media. So when somebody is looking into your organisation as a potential employer, they're actually seeing how you're addressing your organisation, what your culture is like, and whether or not they'll feel welcomed when they come to work with you. So once we've identified those who and created a space where people are attracted to us and attracted to your organisation, what does best practice for selection and interview look like? And there's a range of simple strategies that we can do to create a really inclusive selection process. And it's important first, though, that hiring managers do receive cultural competency training so that they can recognise and understand their unique experiences and challenges that they're bringing and their lens of the world, and also see how that relates to First Nations perspectives and applicant experiences. Having cultural awareness training specifically for hiring managers helps avoid biases in the recruitment and selection processes and ensure that First Nations candidates are evaluated fairly. So you may consider flexible interview formats that make candidates feel more comfortable about the process. For example, allowing more times for interviews or creating group interviews or group connections, offering remote or phone interviews, or even having a cultural advisor present can make the process more welcoming. And these adjustments are not just for First Nations people. We know that a more collaborative selection process and recruitment process makes all candidates feel more comfortable and more safe, and the best version of themselves are going to show up during that interview and selection process. It is critical, though, when you're looking at selection and interview processes, that you avoid making assumptions about the candidate's cultural background. Somebody identifying as First Nations people and may not necessarily bring the same challenges or issues as others. So avoid asking closed questions about backgrounds and instead ask open-end questions that allow individuals to share their experiences as they feel comfortable to do so. And don't make assumptions about their cultural connections or their cultural practices. If you are new to this environment, including First Nations community liaisons and leaders in your selection process is a really great way to create valuable insight into local practices, but also ensure that your process is culturally sensitive. So inviting members of the community through those relationships that you've already developed to provide advice and support on your selection processes and even be part of the interview panel is a great way to create a culturally safe environment. So one of the call to action here is to review your interview processes and look at ways that you can incorporate flexibility and inclusivity to ensure that you're not unintentionally creating exclusionary practices or asking questions that will naturally unintentionally select out First Nations people. So different formats and cultural advisors are certainly the best way to start in this regard. One of the questions that we were asked over the last couple of weeks in relation to onboarding staff. So onboarding First Nations employees, just like all employees, is around demonstrating and creating an environment where those staff feel welcomed as soon as they start working in your organisation. And it is a critical step to make sure that your employees feel valued and welcomed and part of the organisation. The onboarding process is also an opportunity to establish a really positive and inclusive workplace culture from the very beginning. And this requires engagement across your workplace, not just the hiring manager or the manager who will be looking after that individual as they start. It's the whole organisation needs to be involved in onboarding. You may start by conducting a welcome and orientation session that not only introduces the employees to the company's culture, your practices and procedures, but it also includes explanations of any specific cultural provisions like cultural leave or time off for sorry business as we talked about in the last two webinars. Making sure that expectations around work hours, the uniform breaks, and even behaviour is really clear from the outset. And this goes to all onboarding processes, but quite often the expectations of First Nations people and how they view your organisation, it needs to be really clear, particularly if you're employing new to industry personnel. It's important to ensure that all your employees are well informed about their rights, things like work health and safety, and any benefits that are applicable and relevant to that particular role. A really great way to actually support an onboarding process is to assign a mentor or a body to help your First Nations employee navigate their new role and the culture. For many First Nations employees, especially those who may be new to the industry, they may be unfamiliar to the workplace or your style of work, and that can feel daunting and a little bit scary. So a mentor or a buddy helps provide support, helps them build relationships within the organization and navigate some of those policies and practices that exist within the organization. And in fact, that feedback is important to help them learn the ropes as they continue in their first 100 days or first few months. So a really simple way is to actually review your existing onboarding processes to ensure that your hiring managers in your organization is culturally safe to start and you've had that ongoing cultural awareness training and providing that buddy. If you do have other First Nations employees in your organisation or other diverse employees, making connections with your new employees and your new First Nations employees is also another way to build safety and cultural safety in the workplace. And it also creates a great community. This might include inviting them to participate in cultural events or community activities, which will help them feel more comfortable and reduce the risk of culture shock, which often we feel when we're joining a new organisation. Also offering access to First Nations specific support services or cultural advisors, employee assistance programs that are tailored for First Nations people is also important to consider, whether you're a small or large organisation. And those support services help manage workplace challenges and responsibilities to family and community. And again, our Cultural Capability Toolkit has links and references to some support networks that you may use if needed for your organisation. Ultimately, onboarding staff is about creating a culturally safe and respectful environment. And this is about ensuring that all members of the staff have an understanding of bringing in diverse cultures and what that means for them and the unconscious bias that they may bring to the workplace. So ensuring that the whole workplace is included in those discussions and understand that change is critical to ensure that your onboarding processes are embedded and also adopted by the whole organisation. One of the key aspects here is encouraging open communication and feedback throughout the onboarding process. Not only does this provide you valuable information about how that employee is doing in your organisation, it does help to build trust with that individual, but also the broader organisation, and ensures that the employee, the hiring manager, and other staff feel supported through their journey in the organisation. So we've looked about recruitment, we've talked about how to bring people on and attract them and then onboard them so they feel safe, but how do we engage and retain First Nation staff? So in terms of engagement, one of the key aspects here is to ensure that you continue to provide opportunities for development and provide that feedback loop, which we spoke about in our last webinar. One way that is a great way to commence engagement is about providing mentorship and career development opportunities. So it's about long-term relationships, whether it's a mentor program or career development. It's about signaling to that employee that you want them to be part of your organization in the long term. So allowing people or enabling people to understand what their pathway within the organization looks like is critical early on. So you may provide development or leadership programs within your organization for staff as they connect, or looking at mapping out their career progression within your organization and identifying what opportunities they may want to approach as they progress within the organization. It's important to recognize that not all individuals want to progress and be promoted through an organization. So this goes back to that early conversation around creating an environment where you can connect and provide feedback from your employees to understand how they want to progress in their organization and how they're going to show up. For those who do have career progression in mind, understanding what their expectations are, what their aspirations are, and planning and developing career opportunities to align with that is a great way to actually retain First Nation staff in the long term. Also, celebrating milestones and creating an environment where cultural practices are recognised and celebrated is really key. So, this is around cultural leave obligations, respecting cultural obligations, but also celebrating milestones such as NAIDOC Week and National Reconciliation Week, and not just in a tokenistic way, making this part of the organisation and inviting the whole organisation into these celebrations ensures that those individuals feel safe and will continue to grow and share with the organisation. These types of celebrations foster a sense of belonging and pride for those First Nations employees, while also helping your non-Indigenous staff learn more about First Nations culture and create and foster a strong, culturally safe environment. Finally, it's really important that your organisation offers safe spaces for cultural expression. Now, this may be physical spaces like a quiet room or prayer rooms or for reflection or a yarning circle, or it might be through the way you communicate in communication channels for for your staff to ensure that they can actually communicate how they feel about the organisation. It's really important when we're creating cultural safety that employees feel comfortable to bring their whole identity to work, and also be prepared and be able to share some of the challenges or wins that they may be having in their whole life. Remembering work and home life are often intersected. So it's important that to retain and engage staff, you have good open communication and feedback opportunities for your staff so they can share those wins with you as they progress in your organisation. We do find, though, setting up a mentorship program for First Nations employees is a really great way to start that engagement and retention very, very early on. So pairing them up with senior staff or pairing them up with other First Nations employees who've gone through the same process they have is a great way for them to feel safe and also start to plan out that career progression and identify the support that's needed. Obviously, supporting with that is looking at leave policies and cultural obligation policies to ensure that all aspects of the organisation are set up to support employees as they start and progress through the organisation. One of the other ways that we see organisations starting to develop and build their engagement is through reconciliation action plans or Indigenous engagement strategies. Developing a reconciliation action plan, whether you're a small organisation or a large multinational, is one of the most powerful ways your business can demonstrate its commitment to reconciliation and, importantly, though, cultural inclusivity. A RAP is a formal framework that outlines the steps that your business will take to promote inclusion, support community engagement, and foster understanding of First Nations people, all the things that we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks. So whether you have a formal reconciliation action plan or you create an Indigenous action plan or an Indigenous engagement plan for your organisation, it should include specific hiring and retention goals for First Nations staff. It may include regular engagement with First Nations communities and also engagement with those organisations to identify the talent pool that you may not know exists within your community. It's also a great way to establish strategies for celebrating and honouring First Nations culture within your workplace. So implementing a RAP also encourages your organisation to hold itself accountable to those goals and drives that continuous improvement and continuous learning that we've been talking about. And in the Cultural Capability Toolkit, there's some tips and hints on how you can start developing strategies, whether it's a RAP or other engagement strategies or inclusion strategies within your workplace to support the development of cultural safety. So you might start a reconciliation action plan or similar by engaging with a First Nations community leader to ask them about what your community needs or what the expectations are from you as an organisation. If you're a medium-sized enterprise, you probably have a solid footprint within the community that you're working, and engaging with your First Nations organisations and community leaders may actually provide opportunities to find talent and potential pipeline talent that you are looking for, not only now, but as you grow your business. So setting clear targets around recruitment and retention often comes part of a reconciliation action plan or an internal strategy. And this is a good way to hold the organisation accountable, but also start the conversation. Simply setting the target isn't enough. You then need to have an action plan on how you're going to implement that. And that's where the diversity, equity, and inclusion or a HR team will be then responsible for helping the organisation build the required strategies and plans and processes to enable those goals to be achieved. Setting clear targets also holds not only hiring managers accountable, but the broader business and at a strategic level or at an executive level as well. So there are a number of ways that we can look at recruiting, attracting, and retaining First Nations staff. And there's so many different ways, depending on whether you're a small enterprise or a large company or indeed a government organisation, about how you're attracting people to your organisation. The market has shifted recently, and we do recognise that it's now about identifying ways to attract First Nations people to your workforce and finding that hidden talent that exists within your community. And so here to finish off today, we want to talk through 6 key actions for recruiting and retaining First Nations staff in your organisation. So we started today by talking about the DE&I team, and these are 6 actions that you can start today and perhaps work through over the next couple of months. So understanding from a working group, what do we as an organisation, whether it's your senior leadership team, your HR team, or a combination of both, what is the strategy or the plan that you want to see? Why do you want to engage with First Nations staff, and aligning that with your broader business strategy is critical. So setting up a working group to have that conversation to drive your efforts is a really great first step. Building a dedicated recruitment strategy for First Nations people by partnering with local organisations or communities is the next way that you can start identifying potential First Nations employees within your area. Now, there are a range of work-ready programs available for First Nations people or communities where you're working, and there are many organisations dedicated to identifying and matching First Nations talent to organisations who are looking for them. So reach out through the Queensland Government website has a lot of those connections, and those links are also through to the Cultural Capability Toolkit. Ensuring your workplace policies do reflect inclusivity, such as offering flexible cultural leave or support for cultural obligations. And we've talked about that in every webinar because it's critical to provide the foundations of cultural safety. If you're talking about building a culturally safe environment, attracting and retaining First Nation staff, the way that you operate and your business practices need to reflect that culture, and vice versa. So ensuring that you've done that audit or reviewed your workplace policies for discrimination or bias or unconscious bias, what your learning program looks like, or cultural learning workshops, cultural leave, and support for cultural obligations like Sorry Business are critical for those foundational pieces. This also helps foster a workplace environment that actually actively promotes cultural safety. So this isn't just about doing it once and saying we're culturally safe and we leave it. It's about creating an environment of continuous improvement that constantly is promoting cultural safety in the same way that we promote safety within our organisation. Through ongoing training, perhaps mentorship and feedback, allows the organisation to build its cultural safety muscle over time. This is something that takes time for organisations, and we start the journey by doing one of these actions today. Strengthening your relationship with First Nations community is a really great way to increase your engagement and visibility within the community and demonstrate yourself as an employer of choice. Are you showing up at community events? So if you're working within a community that has staff that First Nation staff, are you being seen at the community events? Are you being seen out in the market, or you're looking quite insular? So looking out to the broader community and engaging with them helps people understand what you do and why they should come and work for you. Finally, developing a RAP or similar, or in First Nations engagement strategy, is a way that you can formalise your long-term commitments to cultural inclusion and providing that accountability framework. These aspects combined provide all the foundations and the steps that you need to build a culturally safe environment, and also create a workplace environment that's not only going to attract but retain your First Nations staff. Providing communication and continuous feedback, as we've spoken in the last couple of webinars, will of course underpin all of these aspects that we talked about today in terms of recruiting and retaining First Nations staff. Critical when we're talking around building an environment of cultural safety, building an environment of cultural capability, and importantly, retaining and attracting First Nations staff is fundamentally about setting an intention to create an inclusive environment in your workplace. So while we've been talking over the last couple of weeks around First Nations perspectives, all the perspectives that we've been talking today reflects broader cultural diversity practices within your organisation. So as you're working through this from a First Nations lens, we also invite you to consider it from a broader cultural diversity space as well. And when you dive into the Cultural Capability Toolkit, you'll see links and references to that broader conversation as well. But it does start very simply with understanding where you are as an organisation, what you want to do to attract or build your First Nations engagement, and then creating policies and practices to support that. Now, I've mentioned a lot about our cultural capability toolkit, and again, these webinars are a reflection of those. You can actually you scan this code online if you haven't already, and you'll be able to, it'll take you straight through the cultural capability resource. Now, this resource has been developed as an online diving in, diving out resource, so you can identify the areas that you want to play with first, if you like. So as a web-based activity, you can dive in. Maybe it's recruitment strategies today, maybe it's around cultural awareness training, or simply familiarizing yourself with the welcome to country or acknowledgement of country protocols. The cultural capability resource is a resource that the Queensland government will be building and continuing to build and develop over time. And there are many great links that you can use there to engage and to build your knowledge internally. Remember, though, it is not the only resource. There are a number of resources available on the Queensland Government, on the business.gov website that you can dive into that will support your journey for building not only cultural safety, but attracting First Nations employees and maintaining them in your organisation. So that concludes the formal section today. Now, we've left a little bit extra time today because we know we had a lot more questions last time. And so I'd like to thank you again for joining us, and I'm going to invite Bernadette to come and join us for our Q&A.
Thanks, Jenny, and thank you so much for joining us from Cherbourg today. I'm joining from Meanjin, and I really appreciate we've got so many people online and a few questions been raised. I think we've just lost Jenny off the screen there, just to make sure. You're still there? Fantastic.
I am. Yeah.
The first question we have, Jenny, is can you explain what sorry business is and what it means for possible leave entitlements?
It's a great question. Now, I'm only talking from a general perspective. Sorry business is really around how we reflect and respect and honour people as they pass after death in the family. So when we talk family for some communities may be 2 or 3 extensions. So it's not just what you may consider immediate family. So father, mother, auntie, brother, sister, it actually could extend beyond then. Due to our familial connections, sorry business often includes the whole community. So when we're talking about sorry business, depending on the environment and depending on the community that the individual has come from, it may actually be 2 or 3 days, and for others, it may be some weeks. In some of the more remote communities, if you have employees that have come and working originally from remote communities, sorry business can last up to 2 weeks. So what it means for leave entitlements, it's about recognising that employees who may need to attend and have cultural obligations to attend sorry business may need to take extended leave. Now, that doesn't mean it needs to be paid extended leave. It may simply be you might have 2 to 3 days of standard cultural funeral leave or sorry business leave, but then you may provide leave without pay for the extended period of time, acknowledging that they need that time to fulfill their cultural obligations before returning to work. We often see that as one of the biggest challenges in organisations when we don't have that extended leave and they may not have paid leave, and then they can't fulfil that cultural obligation. And that actually creates tension and disconnect with the organisation. So having a conversation around what sorry business or cultural leave may look like for your organisation is a really great way to start your deep diving and understanding. And there's a really great resource and some definitions within the cultural capability toolkit and some guidelines on what you may want to look at for your policy. So I really encourage you to have a look at the toolkit. You're just on mute, Bernadette.
We also had another question about First Nations employees in terms of how to manage high absenteeism or issues such as that.
So it's a really interesting point, the connection between First Nations employees and absenteeism. There's not always a connection. Sometimes it's just coincidence that they coincide. So absenteeism is something that all organisations need to manage, of course. So it goes back to a question is why is the individual absent? Why are they not coming to work? We just spoke about cultural, business then. That is one of the for many of the clients that I've worked with, that is one of the core reasons people don't come back to work, because they're not given that space to go on cultural business or cultural leave. They take their time for sorry business and then they don't feel they can come back to work. So creating those expectations early and an environment where you can say, this is what we're offering you. This is how many days you have cultural leave. Come and talk to us if you have cultural obligations, actually helps reduce the likelihood of absenteeism because the expectations are really clear. So like absenteeism in most organizations. It's a misalignment of expectations, somebody not feeling safe to have those conversations, or they're just not happy in the workplace. So I would encourage you to create open dialogue with your staff and set those expectations really clearly around all the cultural practices, cultural leave, but also just expectations about what you can and can't do as an employee.
Thanks, Jenny, for that. I had a question to ask you today.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier about job advertisement, and if I'm doing a job advertisement and you talked about using inclusive language, could you give me an example of what you mean by inclusive language, please?
Yeah, so often we see most organizations, I'll take a step, most organizations have boilerplate job ads. So they tend to use a very standard approach or this is what the organization is, here's the information, and it's really all about the organization. For most First Nations people, and obviously I can't speak for every First Nations person, but for most First Nations people, we want to work with an organisation that feels aligned to our values and that we can connect with. So when you're looking at a job advertisement, consider it from the point of view of your applicant rather than the organisation. So the first advice that we give when we're talking to organisations about reviewing job ads is to say, are you talking about yourself too much, or you're actually inviting the right type of candidate? So telling the candidate what it's like to work in the organisation, what they can expect from the organisation, and the type of person that you're looking for, rather than focusing specifically on skills. We recognise that many First Nations people's journey into employment has been different. They may not have formal qualifications. Some of them may be overqualified. And when you restrict job ads to very boilerplate style approaches where we only need, we're asking for very specific a specific pathway, you inadvertently exclude not only First Nations people, but anyone who hasn't followed that traditional pathway. So are you speaking from the perspective of your organisation, or are you inviting people in to understand what the organisation and the job role is like? Does that answer your question, Bernadette?
That does. I also had another question about, you mentioned about giving flexibility in the recruitment process.
Yeah.
Does giving flexibility mean that you have to have more time? Because I know a lot of businesses are time poor.
No, it doesn't. And it's a great question. It's not about providing more time. It's really about ensuring that your recruitment process and your selection process in that selection piece is fit for purpose for the job. So if you're looking for an executive role, what are the skills, or if you're looking for a middle manager or even a frontline new to industry role, what are the things that you need to see from that employee, that potential employee, that's going to show you that they're right for the job? And we know that traditional interview panels don't necessarily demonstrate that at any level of organization. So what we say is design your recruitment process or your selection process with the time that you have, but in a way that makes sure that you're really showcasing individuals. So an example for that might be, instead of doing a panel interview where you have 3 members of your organization with one person asking questions to an individual, you might actually have a group discussion. So you might actually bring 3 or 4 people into the room and ask each of them questions in a more conversational style. It actually saves you time because you're actually being able to interview and connect with a number of people at once. But what you're actually showcasing is how people interact with each other and how they respond in a group environment. That's really what you want to know when you ask that teamwork question anyway. So it doesn't mean more time. It's actually just creating selection processes that are fit for purpose within your constraints, whether it's time or whether it's kind of location.
Jenny, we also had another question about support for First Nations employees.
I think you're on mute, Bernadette.
Can you hear me now? We might have a lag. Yep, thanks. Okay. We also had a question about support for First Nations employees, particularly if the employer maybe have a history of that hasn't welcomed First Nations employees. So this might go more to what else is in the resource about support for First Nations employees in terms of, I know you've pointed out mental health support. What other supports would you suggest?
I think an EAP support is really important. So because again, communication styles and some of the challenges that First Nations employees are different to normal. So it's not necessarily mental health support, but having a First Nations led or First Nations culturally capable EAP is a really great way. That actually is probably a great kind of all-round support for a small organisation, because a good EAP with First Nations advisors on the other end of the phone can talk about family challenges, can talk about some of the expectations misalignment, can talk about some of the, maybe some of the culture shock, but also can help with some of the mental health challenges that you want to provide all employees. So I think finding a good EAP support network is critical for all organisations, whether big or small. Some of the other support you might do is that community network. For many staff, particularly new to industries, and if you're in a remote location and people are coming to you to work and you're looking, or even from locals, that community aspect is really critical. So what is the community that you're building for your employees? If they're FIFO or DIDO workers, is there a community and a space that they can go to share ideas and have those conversations to create a space that they feel safe? So they're essentially bringing their family into, or creating a new family. So I would suggest community hubs or opportunities for them to share and connect with other employees who are on a similar journey or same journey is really critical. Also, and I think every employee needs this, but we see great success with First Nations employees for retention, is that mentoring or buddy system. So providing somebody, whether they're First Nations or not, but First Nations is much better because they've actually walked the same path, who can actually help them navigate some of the politics that exist in organizations. So, hey, if you need this, let's show you how to use the policies. Let's show you how to navigate our systems. So I think it's those kind of standard wraparound services that you want for an employee to make them feel welcomed and supported. But that will be different to every employee. I joined the Air Force when I was 24. We came in and we had a sort of generic onboarding system. And then I spent 3 years trying to find people and support to sort of show and navigate. So you find that right buddy. So if you can fast track that for somebody and give them a buddy to start with who's going to help them navigate, provide good EAP support, and then make sure your communication channels are really open and there's good feedback, you'll be able to, build a strong cultural safety and a strong community culture within your organisation.
That's a good response. Thanks, Jenny, for that. And we got a thumbs up for that response. Thank you. There was another question. There's no more questions in the chat, so please add them if you have them. But I do have another one for you, is that you mentioned unconscious bias of hiring managers. Can you tell me what you mean by that?
Yeah, it's one of the biggest challenges that we see with hiring managers, is that often we're so used, and it's a human behavior, that we tend to hire what we know and what we look at and what we see, right? So if we've been hiring the same type of person for the last 20 years or even the last 5 years, our natural preference when we're looking at interview panels or group panels is to actually hire what we already know. It's a sense of safety. It provides us safety and reduces uncertainty when we're hiring what we think is the same as us. So often, particularly First Nations people, they're going to come in all different types with different experiences. And when that experience doesn't align with the existing expectations of that hiring manager, immediately there's an alert that says, well, they're not going to be able to do it because they don't look like everybody else. They don't have the same experience path as everyone else, or perhaps the same qualifications as everyone else. Those elements are mostly unconscious bias. And we know you don't often need a degree for every kind of role that says you must have a degree qualification. Other than technical things like engineers and accountants and perhaps doctors and nurses, for general roles, you may not need to have a graduate degree to be an administrator or to even be a project manager. You might hire someone who's really keen and well organized, and you could train them to be a project manager and put them through that Cert 4 into a degree. But you don't need that to hire them. So the unconscious bias comes in when we naturally, as humans, will find and be attracted to people who look and feel like us with similar experiences. Recognizing that early and saying, what is it that we actually need for this job? What is the baseline that we need for the job? What would success look like for a candidate, and hire to that, regardless of some of those other assumptions that we make, will actually get a better outcome for the organisation, but also start breaking down some of that unconscious bias.
Thanks, Jenny. So if I was looking to hire, I'm looking at increasing my talent pool, and I thought that maybe a First Nations person could really benefit a role, and I thought, okay, I would like that to be an identified position. What tools or resources would you suggest that people look at to frame up their job description in the right way, being culturally sensitive, like you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, there's some really great tools on and links in the Cultural Capability Toolkit. There's also some great links on the business.gov website that actually takes you to show some job ads and actually outline what that might look like. I think the best way to do it, though, is to actually work with a First Nations advisor or First Nations organisation. And I know within the DESBIT, within the PIPO team, there's a lot of internal resources that you can actually lean on to say, hey, help me develop this tool internally before actually going externally. So I would actually say, go to the DESBIT website, have a look at the resources that exist there first. There are some great tools and templates that you can download there. I would say connect with the Indigenous Business Connect network in this across Queensland. The principal Indigenous project officers that exist across DESBIT, they have that knowledge and understanding, and they can also help direct you to the organisations and the departments that can support you doing that. But definitely start at the toolkit and then work your way out on the business.queensland.gov website.
Thanks, Jenny. Well, I don't think we've got any other questions in there. Was there any last questions? Your last chance. Otherwise, we will be posting this recording on the website, and we're definitely receptive to feedback for additional links that the resource might be able to help with. So I'll hand back over to you, Jenny. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Bernadette. Again, thank you everyone who stayed the course for us over the last 3 workshops. It's been an absolute pleasure sharing a little bit more about the Cultural Capability Toolkit. I really do encourage you and urge you to take a look at the toolkit, dive in and dive out of it. You can scan it on your phone. I actually have it. I use the QR code when we first started delivering these, and I often share the link on my mobile because sometimes you have that burning question and it's accessible on your mobile with that QR code, and you can actually dive in, dive out, and answer those questions that you need to help build your organization. Thank you again for your support and your attendance at our workshops. As Bernadette has said, we'll be posting these online. To find out more about the broader resources that Queensland Government have, though, we do encourage you to go to business.qld.gov.au, type in cultural capability or type in First Nations employment or onboarding, and you'll actually get a range of resources and links through the Queensland Government website that will allow you and direct you to answer some of those questions that you need. Thank you again. It's been my pleasure. Have a wonderful day, and we look forward to seeing you in the Capability Toolkit in the near future. Thanks so much, everybody.